Cal Dorsey made sure our daughter never found us. The microphone caught the slight, practiced break in his voice. I gripped my metal pen until the edge pressed hard enough to leave a mark in my palm. The courtroom smelled heavily of lemon polish and stale air conditioning, and the silence that followed his words felt thick enough to suffocate in. I am 28 years old, and as an auto insurance fraud investigator, my entire career relies on tracking timelines and watching people lie about damaged property. Today, the damaged property was me. The man on the witness stand was Michael Walsh, my biological father, and he was lying under oath for a share of $2.8 million. My attorney, Mara, did not object. She just stood up, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She walked to the front and placed a thick, sealed manila envelope on the judge's desk. The heavy thud of paper hitting wood made my biological mother, Laura, flinch from her seat across the aisle. Her perfect mask of a grieving parent slipped for just a second. Mara smoothed her suit jacket and addressed the bench. She stated that her client's guardian left specific instructions. The envelope was only to be opened if his character or his final will were challenged in open court. The judge picked up the envelope, examining the wax seal with a quiet frown. He said we would finish the foundational testimony before introducing new evidence and set the package aside. I put my pen down on the table. I knew exactly what was inside that envelope because I had seen the physical copies 8 months ago, but I had never watched the video statements sitting at the bottom of the stack. The sharp rustle of the judge sliding the heavy envelope across his desk sounded exactly like the paper sheets on a hospital bed. 16 months earlier, the only sound in Cal's hospital room had been the steady hiss of the oxygen machine. The room smelled of bleach and fading hope, but I refused to acknowledge either. I sat in the plastic chair beside his bed, reading off the inventory list for the garage. I told him we needed to order more brake pads, and that the roof in Bay 3 was leaking again. If I kept talking about the garage, he had to come back to run it. Cal reached out. His hand, thin and rough from 40 years of engine grease, pushed my clipboard down. He told me I needed to listen. He said he had finished the estate planning and that I would not have to sell the tow trucks or the property to cover his medical debts. I told him I did not want to talk about estate planning. I wanted to talk about next week's work schedule. He ignored me and laid out the numbers. The old garage, the half-acre of commercial land it sat on, the small house he had paid off, and his retirement accounts. The city had grown around our little independent shop, pushing the land value up for decades. The total estate was worth almost $2.8 million. My chest tightened and I pushed the chair back. I asked him why he was doing this, why he was talking like he was already gone. He pointed to a battered leather binder on the bottom shelf of his bedside table. The spine was permanently stained with motor oil. He asked me to open it. The binder was heavy. I placed it on my lap and unzipped the cover, feeling the plastic sleeves inside stick together slightly. In the very first sleeve, I saw a copy of a police report from 20 years ago, the night I was left outside his garage. But behind that were copies of letters. Dozens of them, neatly dated and organized by year. Next to the letters were photographs. I turned a page and stopped breathing. Staring back at me was a picture of myself at 18, wearing a bright blue high school graduation gown. Cal had taken that picture in the driveway. I had always believed it was just the two of us that day. I looked up from the binder, and my voice sounded hollow in the quiet room. I asked him who he had sent these to. Cal closed his eyes. He said he sent them to Michael and Laura. He sent them every major milestone, every school program, every new stage of my life. The cold thing that had been sleeping behind my ribs for 20 years suddenly woke up. I asked him how he could let me believe they simply disappeared, how he could let me think they never tried to look for me, when he knew exactly where they were. He looked at the ceiling and told me he thought he was protecting me. He said they ran away because of a warrant, and when they finally settled down, they built a new life without me. He sent the letters through a lawyer so they always had a safe way to respond. But he admitted he was afraid. Afraid that if they answered, they would use their biological rights to take me away from the only home I knew. I stood up, dropping the binder onto the chair, and walked out into the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. I leaned against the cold plaster wall and tried to breathe. I was furious with him for deciding what I could handle. I needed air, so I started walking toward the nurse's station. As I moved, my mind automatically cataloged the documents I had just seen. There was a postal return receipt tucked into the front pocket of the binder. I had only glanced at it, but the date was stamped clearly. 3 weeks ago, right after Cal's terminal diagnosis. I turned around and walked back into the room. I picked up the binder and pulled the green slip of paper out. It was a delivery confirmation for the final letter he had sent them. Right on the bottom line, written in sharp black ink, was Michael Walsh's signature. They knew Cal was dying, they knew I was about to be alone again, and they had chosen silence. I looked at the man in the bed. He was watching me carefully, waiting for my judgment. I told him he should have given me the choice to be rejected again. He nodded slowly, not making a single excuse. I set the binder down on the edge of the bed and covered his weathered hand with mine. I told him I was still angry, but he was the one who stayed, and that made him my father. Cal squeezed my fingers. He told me his lawyer had all the original receipts, the tracking numbers, and a video statement he had recorded the day before he came into the hospital. He said he knew human nature, and he knew what people did when there was a lot of money on the table. 14 months later, Cal was gone. 3 weeks after his funeral, a black SUV I did not recognize pulled into the driveway of the garage. A man in a sharp suit stepped out, looked around at the grease-stained concrete, and walked into my office. He looked right at me and said they had come to bring their daughter home. But as he spoke, his eyes drifted over my shoulder, locking onto the commercial real estate valuation board I had left sitting on my desk. The man in the sharp suit finally tore his gaze away from the valuation board on my desk. He turned back to me, wearing a smile that did not reach his eyes. Michael Walsh, the man who had driven away 20 years ago. A woman stepped out from behind his broad shoulders. Laura. My biological mother looked exactly like the woman who used to pack my lunchboxes, just older, her blonde hair carefully styled to hide the gray. She moved forward with her arms open, tears already forming in the corners of her eyes. I took one step back. My heavy work boots hit the concrete floor with a loud scuff, and the sound stopped her dead in her tracks. Her arms dropped slowly to her sides. "Aaron," she whispered. Her voice trembled perfectly. "We looked for you for so long." I picked up a wrench from the counter and wiped a smudge of grease off the handle with a shop rag. "What address did you search first?" Silence stretched across the small office, heavy and thick. Michael cleared his throat and adjusted his expensive silk tie. He said the system had made it incredibly difficult, that there were strict privacy laws and bureaucratic walls preventing them from locating me. I set the wrench down on the metal workbench. I told them they were trespassing on commercial property and needed to leave immediately. If they had business regarding the estate, they could contact my attorney, Mara Ellison. I pointed toward the open bay doors, waiting. Neither of them moved for a long moment. They simply stared at me like I was a broken machine that had not delivered the product they paid for. Then Michael placed a firm hand on Laura's back and guided her out to the black SUV. 2 days later, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. A Facebook message request popped up on my screen from Laura Walsh. The message was a long, emotional block of text, detailing how she had prayed for my safety every single night for 2 decades. I did not accept the request. I took a screenshot, emailed it to a new folder on my laptop named Walsh Evidence, and deleted the notification. My professional life involved documenting fraud. A wrecked car bumper never lied, but the person driving the vehicle always did. I decided right then to treat my biological parents exactly like a suspicious insurance claim. The next morning, Mara forwarded an email to me. Michael had sent a PDF document titled Family Accounting to her office. I opened the file and found a meticulously itemized list. Diapers, formula, daycare fees, rent percentages. He had calculated the exact cost of raising me for the first 8 years of my life. A polite note at the bottom stated they would graciously forgive this family debt if we could come to a private arrangement regarding Cal's estate. I closed the document and told Mara to add it to the file. I refused to let them turn my existence into an invoice. Mara met me at the garage later that week. We sat in the office while the roar of an air compressor echoed from the work bays. She opened her leather briefcase and pulled out Cal's estate plan. She explained that Cal had left me everything: the garage business, the house, the investment accounts, and the land. But there was a severe complication. Years ago, when I was still a minor, Cal had drafted an earlier version of his will. That old document included a small reunification fund. It was specifically designed to help Michael and Laura reestablish their lives if they ever came back and went through the proper legal channels to see me. When I turned 18, and after they had ignored dozens of letters, Cal canceled that provision entirely. Mara tapped the new will with her pen. Because they were named in a previous version and removed in the final one, they had legal standing to challenge the changes. The old document gave them their foot in the door. I walked out into the bays with a commercial real estate appraiser that afternoon. He was a tall man who kept checking his expensive watch and wiping sweat from his forehead in the humid air. We walked the perimeter of the half-acre lot. The neighborhood around the shop had transformed completely over the years. Fancy coffee shops and high-density apartments had replaced the old manufacturing warehouses. The appraiser looked at the cracking asphalt and the faded paint on our garage doors. He said the building was practically worthless, but the dirt underneath it was an absolute goldmine. Developers had been trying to buy this corner for a decade, and Cal had turned down every single offer. He wanted me to have a place that belonged completely to me. I looked at the rusted frame of a vintage truck sitting in the corner bay and decided I was not selling a single square foot of it. That evening, an email arrived directly to my personal inbox. Michael wanted to meet at a diner on the edge of town, just the three of us. No lawyers, no court reporters. Just a family trying to heal, the email claimed. If I refused, he warned that a local reporter was very interested in a tragic story about an old mechanic who had isolated a vulnerable child from her loving parents. The threat was clear and calculated: comply, or they would destroy Cal's reputation in the press. I took another screenshot. I did not reply. The official legal petition arrived the following Monday. Mara brought it to the shop in a thick manila folder. I washed my hands at the utility sink, dried them on a rough paper towel, and sat down at my desk to read the charges. They accused me of exerting undue influence over a dying man. They claimed Cal had manipulated a broken system to steal their daughter. I read one specific sentence twice. It stated that Cal Dorsey had abducted the emotional loyalty of a vulnerable child. I pushed the papers across the desk. A cold, heavy knot formed in my stomach. I asked Mara how they could possibly build a case on isolation when Cal had sent them letters documenting every major milestone of my life. My attorney leaned back in her chair. Her face was perfectly blank, the exact expression she used when opposing counsel made a fatal mistake. She placed her hand flat on the petition and told me they did not just accuse Cal of manipulation. She said Michael and Laura Walsh had sworn under penalty of perjury in a legal filing that they had never received a single letter. In my line of work, a crushed vehicle bumper tells a completely objective story. Metal bends at specific angles depending on speed and force, and shattered glass scatters in predictable patterns. People, on the other hand, sit in my office and swear they were only driving 30 miles an hour when the steel frame of their sedan is twisted like a pretzel. I learned early on to ignore the tears and focus entirely on the physics. I cleared the big whiteboard on the back wall of the garage office. Grabbing a thick red marker, I drew a horizontal line straight across the center and began pinning copies of official documents along the timeline. The first paper was a police dispatch log from 20 years ago. The timestamp proved Cal called emergency services exactly 4 minutes after finding me sitting on a milk crate by the bay doors. The patrol report confirmed the responding officers took me straight to the county hospital and then transferred me to a child protective services facility. Cal did not take me home that night. He followed the law perfectly. The second cluster of documents came from a retired social worker Mara had tracked down. I pinned a faded call transcript next to the police report. The county agency had located Michael and Laura the very next morning by calling a relative's phone number. The notes typed by the caseworker were remarkably detailed. The woman who gave birth to me claimed they were experiencing a severe marital crisis and needed time, but Michael had taken the phone. He asked the caseworker 3 times if police officers were waiting at the agency office. When asked why that mattered, he refused to answer. He promised they would arrive to pick me up within 48 hours. They never showed up. Instead, they packed their car and crossed state lines. Reading the transcript now, the panic made complete sense. Michael was running from a financial fraud warrant, and my presence made them easy for the authorities to track. What the document did not explain was the next 2 decades of complete silence after the initial danger passed. I moved further down the whiteboard. The state did not want to give me to a single older mechanic. As the person who found me, Cal was initially treated with heavy suspicion. I pinned up his background check clearance, the city permit for renovating the spare room in his house, and a completion certificate from a childhood trauma care seminar. Memories surfaced, sharp and sudden. A quiet man with hands rough from sandpaper trying to untangle my hair with a pink plastic brush. A medication schedule taped to the refrigerator right next to a crayon drawing of a tow truck. Stepping back, I looked at the undeniable proof that my biological parents chose to abandon me twice. I pulled out my phone and drafted an email to the local reporter Michael had threatened to use. I wanted to attach the caseworker's notes. Let the whole town read how the grieving father had been too afraid of a police cruiser to come get his 8-year-old child. Mara walked into the office, just as my finger hovered over the send button. She gently took the phone out of my hand. "Those are protected juvenile dependency records, Aaron." My attorney set the device face down on the desk. "If you leak them without a court order, you hand them a procedural victory, and the judge will strike our best evidence." My jaw tightened. It felt like the legal system existed solely to protect the people who had left me sitting on the cold concrete. I crossed my arms and stared at the floor, fighting the intense urge to argue. Finally, I nodded, telling her to file the proper motion and do it the right way. Mara opened her leather briefcase and pulled out one more file folder. She said I needed to look at the last page of the social worker's case notes before we went to court. I took the paper. Halfway down the page, a handwritten note documented a request from Cal. He had explicitly asked the county to keep a communication channel open for Michael and Laura, just in case they stabilized their lives. The mechanic had actively protected their chance to return, but a second note sat right beneath it. Cal had also asked the social worker to delay, telling me that my parents had promised to come back and then vanished. He wanted to shield me from the rejection. And in doing so, he had participated in managing the truth. He loved me, but he was not a flawless savior. I ran my finger over the old paper, processing the fact that my father had kept secrets to protect my feelings. Then my eyes caught a sequence of numbers at the very bottom of the page. The caseworker had recorded a forwarding address Michael provided before they disappeared entirely. Walking over to the heavy iron safe in the corner, I pulled out the certified mail receipt for the letter containing my high school graduation photo. I laid the green receipt directly below the caseworker's notes. Mara leaned over my shoulder, letting out a slow, heavy breath. The address the social worker recorded 20 years ago was exactly the same. Michael and Laura had never moved, and the photo of the blue graduation gown had been delivered right to their front door. Mara and I spent the next morning in her conference room, spreading 20 years of documented history across the polished mahogany table. 12 thick envelopes sat in chronological order. Cal had not bombarded them every month. He chose only the major milestones, routing every single package through his attorney's office to guarantee a secure line of communication. I picked up the first envelope. Inside rested a copy of a photograph taken on my first day back at school. Next to it lay a 10th birthday update, and then a program from a middle school theater production where I had exactly 3 lines. At the bottom of each typed page, my adoptive father had included the exact same sentence: "She is safe, and the door remains open if you approach her honestly." We moved down the table to my teenage years. A photocopy of my first driver's license, the acceptance letter from the auto damage appraisal program, and the photograph of me standing in the driveway, wearing a bright blue high school graduation gown. A few early envelopes bore yellow return stickers, but the majority carried a different mark: delivery confirmation stamps. My hands felt cold as I grouped the green return receipts. 2 of the slips bore a sharp, jagged scrawl that perfectly matched Michael's signature on the recent court filings. A third slip featured a tighter, looped cursive. I slid a copy of Laura's legal deposition next to it. The handwriting matched. The woman who birthed me had personally signed for an envelope containing my 16th birthday pictures. The very last envelope in the line was dated 16 months ago. Cal had written it the week his oncologist told him the cancer had spread. Reading the copy of his letter, I found no mention of the garage, the land, or his financial accounts. He simply wrote that I was an adult now, and the choice to connect belonged entirely to me. Michael had signed for that delivery too. They knew Cal was dying, and they maintained their silence right up until the probate notice revealed the estate's value. 3 days later, we sat in a neutral mediation room downtown. The mediator, a retired judge with tired eyes, asked if the parties could find a way to heal without further litigation. Laura sat across from me, dabbing the corners of her eyes with a crumpled tissue. She spoke softly, directing her words to the mediator instead of me. "We missed her entire life," my biological mother whispered. I close my eyes, and I still see an 8-year-old girl. I never even got to see what she looked like growing up. I remained perfectly still, did not cross my arms, did not break eye contact. The mediator offered a sympathetic nod, asking if perhaps sharing memories now might bridge the gap. "We would love that," Laura said, her voice trembling with manufactured grace. "Just to see her. To know she was happy in that blue graduation gown." The air in the room seemed to vanish. Michael shifted violently in his chair, his elbow knocking a heavy metal pen off the table, but the damage was already done. Laura's mouth parted slightly as she realized what she had just said. She stared at the wood grain, her knuckles turning white. I did not yell. Reaching for my legal pad, I clicked my pen, wrote down the phrase, "blue graduation gown," and pushed the yellow paper toward the center of the table. Mara closed her binder with a sharp snap. She informed the mediator that we were done for the day and requested a formal evidentiary hearing. Walking to the elevator, my chest tight with a strange, jagged energy, I turned to my attorney. I asked if we could force them to turn over whatever they had kept from those mailings. Mara pressed the down button. She explained that we could issue a subpoena, but only if we could prove they still possessed the physical items. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was an email forwarded from Mara's office assistant. Opposing counsel had just sent an urgent message. Michael and Laura, the email stated, had recently searched their attic and may have located a small box of old family photographs. The cardboard shoebox smelled of cedar and damp dust. Laura placed the container on the glass conference table inside Mara's office, refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the room. Her attorney cleared his throat, stating for the official record that his client had just discovered the item in the back of a hallway closet. He claimed the woman had absolutely no memory of how long it had been sitting there. Mara did not touch the worn cardboard. My attorney pulled a pair of latex gloves from her leather briefcase and began dictating a strict chain of custody form to the court reporter. Every single movement in the room felt deliberately slow. I watched Laura's manicured hands tremble as her lawyer lifted the lid. Inside the box sat a thick stack of glossy paper. My entire childhood, printed and neatly catalogued, waited in the fluorescent light. Mara laid the images out one by one across the glass. The middle school theater program, the 16th birthday picture standing by the tow truck, my first driver license, the photograph showing the bright blue graduation gown. I picked up a picture of myself standing in front of Cal's garage at age 12. Turning the stiff paper over, I found faded blue ink pressed into the back. The handwriting was tight and looped. I recognized the exact penmanship from the postal delivery receipts we had reviewed earlier. My biological mother had carefully labeled every single photograph with my age and the corresponding year. I picked up another picture. This specific image felt softer, the corners rounded down, and a distinct vertical crease ran straight down the middle of my face. Someone had folded the graduation photograph and carried it inside a wallet for years. They had not simply tossed Cal's envelopes into a dark closet and forgotten them. They had opened the mail, studied my face, and kept the evidence close. That afternoon, I locked the heavy steel deadbolt on the garage storage room door. The enclosed space smelled strongly of stale rubber and thick engine grease. I sat down on a wooden crate of replacement radiators and stared at the digital scans Mara had just emailed to my phone. Knowing my biological parents had ignored me was a cold, solid fact I had built my entire adult life around. Realizing they had watched me grow up from a safe distance, feeling just enough attachment to keep my picture, but not enough courage to drive over and claim me, felt entirely different. It felt like breathing broken glass. I opened my laptop and started typing furiously. I drafted a massive public post, attaching the tracking receipts, the social worker notes, and the folded wallet photograph. I wanted the entire city to see exactly what kind of victims Michael and Laura Walsh really were. I wanted to burn their reputation to the ground. But as I scrolled through the final scanned images from the bottom of the shoebox, a different picture caught my attention. The subject was not me. A young girl with blonde hair sat on a red bicycle, grinning with 2 missing front teeth. Turning the digital file over on my screen, the same blue ink labeled the back. Claire, age 6. My sister. A full-blood sibling born exactly 2 years after they left me sitting by the bay doors. Claire was 18 years old now, and according to the legal filings, she lived in the very same house. She had grown up completely surrounded by the manufactured lie that a broken legal system stole me away. If I hit publish on my drafted post, the collateral damage would hit her first. She would discover her entire family history was a fabrication through a viral social media update. My finger hovered over the trackpad. I thought about Cal, and how the old mechanic had always protected my right to choose the truth on my own terms. Hitting delete, I watched the angry draft disappear from the screen. I would use the evidence inside a courtroom, where it belonged, and nowhere else. Beneath the photo of Claire in the digital file sat a scanned piece of yellow legal paper. I zoomed in on the faded handwriting. It was a drafted letter, heavily edited with crossed-out words, addressed directly to Cal. "Tell Erin we are proud of her," the yellow paper read. "But we cannot have her contacting Claire. We have to protect our family." The letter had never been mailed. Laura had actually considered writing back to the garage, but the woman actively chose the comfort of her new life over my right to exist in theirs. She kept the photos to soothe her own guilt, while ensuring I remained a secret. The next morning, we resumed the official deposition. Mara slid the physical shoebox across the table directly toward Michael. She asked him to identify the blue handwriting on the back of the photographs. The man stared at the ink. A small muscle feathered in his jaw. He looked at his wife, his practiced calm, finally shattering into genuine panic. He swore on the official record that he had never seen the box before in his life, and that his wife must have deliberately hidden it from him. Laura let out a sharp, wounded sound. She pointed a shaking finger at her husband, telling the room that Michael had strictly forbidden her from answering any of the letters. My biological mother claimed the man threatened to leave the house if she ever brought my name up in front of their new daughter. Their unified front cracked wide open. In a matter of seconds, they destroyed each other's sworn testimony right in front of the court reporter, each desperately trying to save themselves. I sat perfectly still, watching the two people who had abandoned me tear their own story apart. The silence in the room was absolute, and I did not need to say a single word to break them. That evening, I stood by the open bay doors, pulling the heavy metal chains to lock up the shop for the night. My cell phone vibrated in my jacket pocket. The caller ID displayed an unknown number from a neighboring area code. I answered, fully expecting a parts vendor or a stranded customer. Instead, a young, unsteady voice echoed through the speaker. "My parents told me you were taken," the girl said, her breath catching audibly in her throat. "They never told me they had pictures of you in our house." The law office smelled strongly of expensive roasted coffee and sharp lemon polish. Claire sat directly across from me at the heavy mahogany table, looking completely out of place in her faded denim jacket. The teenager mirrored Laura perfectly, sharing the same blonde hair and bone structure, just without the hardened, defensive edges. 18 years old. Born exactly 2 years after the night they left me sitting by the closed bay doors. Her knuckles turned white as her fingers gripped a paper cup, buckling the thin cardboard. "They told me the state took you," Claire said. Her voice stayed low, almost a whisper, as if she feared someone was listening at the door. "Dad said a mechanic manipulated a judge. He swore they spent years fighting the system trying to get you back. I slid a single piece of paper across the smooth wood. It was the postal receipt bearing Michael's signature, confirming delivery of my high school graduation photograph. I did not dump the entire shoebox of evidence on her lap, and I did not raise my voice. I simply let the undeniable black ink do the talking. Claire stared at the document. A slow, shuddering breath escaped her lungs, and for a moment, the room was absolutely silent. She did not cry. The young girl did not offer a meaningless apology on behalf of the parents we shared. Instead, she looked up, and her expression hardened into something completely unrecognizable. "My entire childhood is a fabricated lie," she whispered, setting her cup down. "You do not owe me an apology," I told her, keeping my tone perfectly even so she would not feel pressured. "And you absolutely do not have to pick a side today. This is not your fight, Claire." The teenager shook her head, refusing the easy way out. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "Dad used to brag about hiring private investigators," Claire stated. Her eyes narrowed as she processed years of manipulated memories. "He told everyone at our church he spent thousands of dollars tracking down leads. The financial files are kept locked in his home office desk." Mara wrote something down on her yellow legal pad. "My attorney issued a targeted discovery request the very next morning, demanding opposing counsel produce all invoices related to investigative services. When the documents arrived 3 days later, the truth landed on our conference table like a physical blow. The primary invoice clearly showed a massive retainer fee paid exactly 2 weeks after Cal passed away. Michael Walsh had never paid anyone to search for a missing child. Reading through the itemized list of services, the contract specifically listed asset identification, commercial real estate valuation, and probate filing dates. The official investigator report was titled Estate Valuation, not Family Reunification. The man had hired a professional to track $2.8 million, ignoring his daughter completely until the money was guaranteed. Claire called my cell phone later that same week. Through the receiver, the muffled sound of slamming doors echoed in the background. My sister had confronted them right in the middle of their pristine suburban kitchen, refusing to let the lies continue. "He told me he had to do it to protect what rightfully belongs to this family," Claire explained, her voice cracking slightly under the emotional weight. I leaned against the cool brick wall of the garage. I asked how Michael possibly justified the timing of the private investigator. "I asked him why you were not considered family until there was commercial real estate involved," Claire replied, her breathing ragged. "He told me I was too young to understand how the real world works. Then Mom started crying and acting like a victim, so I just walked out." The foundation of their carefully constructed new life was finally cracking, and they were desperately trying to hold the pieces together using the exact same deceptions. Friday afternoon brought another unexpected development. Mara asked me to come down to her office to review a formal settlement demand. The opposing counsel had just filed an emergency motion to seal the court records, claiming the media exposure would cause irreparable harm to their innocent younger daughter. At the exact same time, they offered a way to make the entire lawsuit disappear. Mara slid a thick document across her desk. The freshly printed paper smelled heavily of warm toner. "They are willing to drop the probate challenge completely," Mara explained, tapping the final signature line with her pen. "In exchange, they want $300,000 and a strict non-disclosure agreement." I stared at the requested amount. The money was deeply offensive, but the final paragraph caught my full attention. Michael and Laura required me to sign a sworn legal declaration. They wanted my signature on a document stating that Cal Dorsey had maliciously manipulated the foster care system and actively prevented them from finding me. They did not just want a massive payout. My biological parents desperately needed to buy their public reputation back, and they wanted me to fund the purchase while dragging the only real father I ever had through the mud. Mara watched my face carefully, evaluating my reaction. She asked if I wanted her to draft a standard rejection letter and proceed to trial. I picked up the settlement demand, read the false confession one more time, and set it back down on the glass table. "Schedule the settlement meeting," I said, looking right at my attorney. "I want to hear them say it out loud in front of both lawyers." The air conditioning in the downtown mediation center ran entirely too cold, raising goosebumps on my arms beneath my blazer. Mara and I sat in a small staging room waiting for opposing counsel to signal they were ready to begin. My attorney adjusted her silk collar, quietly reminding me that while I was strictly forbidden from lying during the settlement conference, I had absolutely no legal obligation to correct any false assumptions my biological parents made. I opened my yellow legal pad and wrote down my 3 specific goals for the afternoon. I needed them to acknowledge the existence of the correspondence, confirm their financial demands were directly tied to maintaining their public reputation, and reveal their fear of Cal's recorded statement. A paralegal opened the heavy oak door, gesturing for us to enter the main conference room. The large space smelled of bitter roasted coffee and sharp citrus cleaning supplies. Michael Walsh sat at the far end of the long glass table, wearing a dark navy suit that looked brand new. Laura sat next to him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, presenting the perfect picture of a distressed mother trying to heal a broken family. Their attorney, a sharp-looking man with silver hair, immediately launched into a rehearsed speech about resolving matters privately to protect everyone involved from unnecessary emotional damage. Michael leaned forward, resting his forearms on the glass, and took control of the conversation. The man spoke with practiced paternal authority, ignoring Mara entirely to speak directly to me. He requested $300,000 immediately, along with a 10% share of any future commercial land sale regarding the garage property. He smiled a tight, empty smile, explaining that they had suffered immense emotional distress over the last 2 decades. He called the exorbitant financial demand a reasonable family restitution, framing the extortion as a necessary step toward healing our fractured relationship. I kept my hands resting flat on my legal pad, refusing to match his aggressive posture or show any reaction to the ridiculous numbers. I simply looked at him and asked what exactly that money would purchase. Laura shifted uncomfortably in her oversized leather chair, her gaze dropping to the floor. My biological mother stated they would formally withdraw all their public accusations regarding Cal if I cooperated, sparing everyone a painful public spectacle that would only drag the old mechanic's name through the mud. Taking his cue, Michael added that the sealed envelope currently sitting in the judge's chambers would never need to be opened or played in open court if we settled this as a family today. I picked up my pen, clicking the metal top once in the quiet room. I stared at the man sitting across the table and asked him why he was so terrified of a video he claimed he had never seen. The question hung in the air, cold and heavy. Michael tightened his jaw, clearly searching for a safe legal pivot, but it was Laura who finally cracked under the pressure of the quiet room. The woman slammed her palm flat against the glass table, making her coffee cup rattle in its saucer. Her carefully constructed mask slipped completely, revealing pure, defensive rage. "Your father never wanted you to see those letters," Laura snapped, her voice shrill and echoing sharply off the polished walls. I stopped writing instantly. The metal tip of my pen rested on the yellow paper, leaving a small, expanding pool of black ink. Slowly, I lifted my head and looked directly into her eyes. "Which letters?" I asked. Absolute silence swallowed the conference room. Laura's mouth opened slightly, as she realized exactly what she had just admitted in front of 2 active attorneys. Michael closed his eyes, leaning back in his chair like a man who had just been handed a death sentence. Their attorney froze completely, his pen suspended halfway to his notepad. He looked at his clients, and a dark, angry red flushed rapidly up the back of his neck. The silver-haired lawyer abruptly stood up, pushing his chair back so hard it crashed into the wooden credenza behind him. He demanded an immediate recess and ordered Michael and Laura out into the hallway without another word. Through the frosted glass wall of the conference room, I watched the heated, silent argument unfold in the corridor. The opposing counsel waved his arms, pacing back and forth, clearly demanding answers about a box of photographs and postal receipts his clients had sworn under oath did not exist. When they finally returned to the table 20 minutes later, the lawyer looked completely exhausted. He stated for the official record that he was deeply evaluating his continued representation in this matter, pending a thorough review of his client's previous sworn affidavits. The defeated attorney looked across the table, rubbing his temples, and asked if we were accepting the proposed financial terms. I closed my legal pad and slid my pen into my pocket. I told the room that I would not buy their silence, and I absolutely would not sell the good name of the mechanic who actually stepped up to raise me. I did not raise my voice, and I did not threaten them with the local press. I simply stated that the lawsuit would proceed to an evidentiary hearing, and they could explain their timeline to the judge. Mara packed her briefcase, her expression perfectly neutral, and we walked out of the building together without looking back. The legal trap snapped completely shut late the following Tuesday. Mara called me at the garage, her voice tight with disbelief, and read the newest court filing over the speakerphone. The judge had ordered Michael and Laura to either amend or reaffirm their previous statements under penalty of perjury. Instead of admitting the truth and trying to mitigate the damage, Michael doubled down on the deception. The man deliberately signed his name beneath a freshly typed declaration, legally swearing for a second time that he never received any communication from Cal Dorsey. The echo of Michael Walsh's voice in the courtroom brought me right back to the moment the hearing began. Sitting at the petitioner's table, the man adjusted his expensive suit and looked mournfully at the judge. He had just repeated the exact same lie he committed to paper days ago. My hands rested flat on the polished mahogany defense table, feeling the cool vibration of the air conditioning unit through the wood. I did not interrupt him, because Mara had taught me that a cornered liar always does the most damage to themselves when given enough rope. My attorney stood up and approached the witness stand. She carried a thick stack of certified county records, placing them on the railing right in front of my biological father. Mara asked the retired social worker, now seated in the gallery, to confirm the timeline of the night I was left at the garage. The documents clearly proved Cal called emergency services within 4 minutes. He never hid me from the system, and he followed every legal protocol. Mara then turned her attention back to Michael. She asked him a very simple question. If they truly wanted me back, why did they not drive to a fire station, a hospital, or a police precinct the next morning? The man gripped the edges of the wooden witness box. His face flushed a deep, angry red. He snapped, telling the courtroom he could not walk into a police station with an active warrant hanging over his head. The admissions sucked the air right out of the room. Pressed by Mara's relentless questioning, Michael finally confessed that his auto parts supply business had collapsed 2 decades ago, resulting in a nonviolent warrant for check fraud. Laura gripped her purse in the front row, openly weeping now as she admitted they left me under the bright security lights of the garage because they were terrified my presence would draw police attention. They planned to handle the legal trouble and return for me within 48 hours. Mara paced slowly back to our table. She pointed out that avoiding jail might explain 3 days of panic, but a bad check completely failed to explain 20 years of total silence. The judge leaned forward, writing a sharp note on his legal pad, and formally dismissed their claim of secret custody. Next, Mara introduced the stack of green postal delivery receipts. She projected the documents onto the courtroom monitor, displaying Michael's jagged signature across a dozen different years. Michael shifted his weight, refusing to look at the screen. He claimed someone else must have signed for those packages, suggesting mail fraud or a simple clerical error. In response, my attorney entered 5 different financial contracts from Michael's failed supply business into evidence. A court-appointed handwriting expert had already verified the penmanship. The swooping letters matched the mail receipts flawlessly. Laura took the stand next, her voice shaking as she swore she had never seen a single photograph of me growing up. Mara walked over to her podium and rested her hands on the edges. She asked the woman how, during mediation, she knew about the blue graduation gown. My biological mother swallowed hard. She claimed she saw the image on a social media website and assumed it was public knowledge. I was called to the stand to counter that exact statement. Looking directly at the judge, I testified that my accounts were heavily restricted during high school and that specific image had never been uploaded to the internet. Cal had taken the photo with a disposable camera, printed the physical copies at a local pharmacy, and mailed them directly to their attorney. The only way Laura knew the color of the gown was by opening the envelope herself. The final blow came when Mara submitted the cedar-smelling cardboard shoebox into evidence. She presented the unsent draft written on yellow legal paper, reading the words aloud for the court reporter. The letter proved Laura knew exactly how to contact us, yet she explicitly wrote that protecting her new family took priority. Realizing the trap had completely closed around her, Laura broke down. She pointed a trembling finger at the defense table, loudly blaming her husband for forcing her to hide the box. Michael shouted back from his seat, calling her a hysterical liar. The unified front they had spent months building shattered into pieces right on the courtroom floor. Desperate to salvage their case, Their silver-haired attorney tried to leverage Cal's old estate plan. He argued the original document proved the mechanic recognized their parental rights. Mara did not even raise her voice. She simply read the strict condition attached to that old will, which required them to complete supervised reunification while I was still a minor child. They had never taken a single step through that open door. The final estate plan was not a sudden act of manipulation, but the natural legal result of 20 years of abandonment. The courtroom fell completely silent as Mara returned to her seat. We had systematically dismantled every single deception they brought before the bench. The judge set his pen down and looked at the heavy, sealed manila envelope resting on the corner of his desk. He broke the wax seal with a sharp metal letter opener, pulling out a digital storage drive. "Counsel," the judge said, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "Play Mr. Dorsey's statement." Laura closed her eyes, shrinking down into her chair. Michael turned around to look at his expensive attorney, desperately searching for a way out. But the silver-haired man did not look back. The courtroom bailiff connected a small black flash drive to the media console beside the judge's bench. On the large wall monitor hanging above the gallery, a static loading screen flickered for a fraction of a second before the picture cleared. Cal appeared on screen, sitting at the cluttered wooden desk inside the garage office where he had spent 40 years of his life. The camera angle was slightly wide, showing the grease-stained calendar on the wall behind him and the heavy iron safe in the corner. His face looked gaunt from the chemotherapy treatments, but his eyes were bright, clear, and completely steady. Mara stood quietly beside the defense table, having already submitted the technical metadata, device certificates, and expert medical affidavits, proving the video was recorded while Cal was fully of sound mind, weeks before he entered the hospital. The recording did not begin with dramatic accusations or emotional pleas. Instead, Cal looked directly into the camera lens and began reading a detailed index of documents, citing tracking numbers, dates, and delivery confirmations that matched the physical files we had spent months organizing. On screen, my adoptive father shifted slightly in his chair. He explained that he was recording the statement to protect me from the inevitable legal challenges that would arise after his death. He stated clearly that he had called emergency services immediately the night he found me, ensuring I entered the social services system safely, rather than keeping me hidden or isolated. He did not pretend he was a saint. He looked right into the lens and admitted that he had made mistakes, acknowledging that his biggest fear was losing the only real family he had ever known. The video cut to a sequence of wide shots, where Cal held up each individual envelope to the camera, reading the recipient names and postal tracking codes out loud. The numbers matched the receipts in our binders down to the final digit. He explained how he had routed every single milestone, photograph, and school program through secure legal channels so my biological parents would always have a safe, open door if they ever chose to walk through it. Then the tone of his voice shifted. Cal leaned forward, resting his heavy, grease-scarred hands on the desk. He admitted that he had deliberately chosen to withhold information about their repeated rejections during my teenage years. He looked tired as he confessed that he was afraid if I knew they were ignoring the letters, it would break my heart. But he also admitted a darker, more selfish motivation. He had been terrified that if they ever decided to reply, the courts might force him to hand me over. He took full responsibility for keeping that secret, refusing to blame anyone else for his own emotional protective instincts. The judge leaned in closer, watching the monitor with intense focus. On screen, Cal confirmed that he had told me the complete truth about the letters during our final conversation in the hospital room, weeks before he passed away. A signed note from his attending physician verified that Cal had been lucid, oriented, and capable of understanding the conversation that day. The medical note did not settle the question of undue influence by itself, but it supported the broader timeline. Cal had disclosed the letters to me while he was still alive. I had confronted him, challenged his decision to hide them, and made my own choice about our relationship before his death. Combined with the independent estate planning records, the delivery receipts, and 2 decades of unanswered correspondence, that evidence seriously weakened their claim that I had manipulated a confused, dying man into changing his will. The video moved into its final minutes. Cal softened, looking less like a weary mechanic and more like the man who used to teach me how to check transmission fluid on a Saturday afternoon. He spoke directly to me, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom speakers. He told me I was the absolute light of his life, and that raising me had taught him how to love and trust the world all over again. He apologized once more for deciding what truths I was strong enough to handle, expressing deep regret for the moments he overstepped. He looked away from the camera for a brief second, gathering his thoughts, before delivering his final piece of advice. He told me not to spend my life weighed down by bitterness or anger, urging me to build a future based on peace rather than revenge. He said he was endlessly proud to be my father, no matter what happened to the garage or the land. Then he reached out and tapped the camera lens with his thumb, and the screen faded to black. Absolute silence filled the courtroom. Nobody moved. In the front row, Laura buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with quiet, miserable sobs as she refused to look up. Michael sat stiffly beside her, staring blankly ahead at the wooden railing, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles bulged. Michael turned his head toward the gallery and muttered that the entire recording was nothing more than emotional theater designed to manipulate the court. I did not dignify his pathetic excuse with a response. I kept my hands folded on the table, completely calm, letting his desperate denial hang in the quiet air. The judge cleared his throat, gathering the scattered paperwork into a neat pile. He announced that he had seen and heard enough, ordering both legal teams to submit their final written arguments within the week. He added a quiet, deliberate warning, stating that the formal transcripts detailing Michael's conflicting sworn statements would be forwarded to the district attorney's office for review regarding perjury. Court was adjourned. The heavy oak doors at the back of the room swung open, and the gallery slowly emptied out into the hallway. We walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight. Michael hurried past us, his face flushed with humiliation, desperately trying to avoid the lingering reporters near the courthouse steps. He paused near the curb, turning back to glare at me with pure venom, spitting out that I had intentionally destroyed our family out of spite. Before I could even open my mouth to reply, a familiar voice cut through the noise of the street. Claire stepped around the stone pillar of the courthouse entrance, her expression cold and resolute. She looked directly at the man who raised her, her voice ringing clear and steady in the crisp air. She told him that I did not destroy anything because there was never a real family to begin with. Michael stared at his younger daughter in absolute shock, unable to process that she had finally seen through the years of deception. He turned around without another word, climbing quickly into the back of a waiting taxi and speeding away from the curb. Claire walked over and stood beside me on the concrete sidewalk. We did not hug, and we did not make grand promises about the future. But for the first time in my life, standing there under the open sky, I did not feel like a ghost haunting someone else's memories. I felt entirely grounded in the present, knowing that the truth was finally out in the open, and the only voice that mattered had already been heard. 6 weeks after the evidentiary hearing, the formal ruling finally arrived from the bench. The judge upheld Cal's final will in its entirety, completely dismissing the baseless claims of undue influence and rejecting every single allegation that the old mechanic had intentionally fractured our family ties. Furthermore, because Michael and Laura aggressively pursued litigation long after physical evidence disproved their claims, the court ordered them to cover the vast majority of our legal fees. Their emergency motion to seal the public records was thrown out entirely, ensuring the truth remained visible while safeguarding sensitive information belonging to innocent parties. The legal fallout from their repeated perjury unfolded exactly as the statute demanded. Michael received formal notice that his conflicting court filings had been forwarded to the local prosecutor, and months later, he accepted a formal plea agreement involving heavy financial fines and court-ordered community service, avoiding any dramatic or sensationalized prison sentences. Laura chose to cooperate fully with investigators once her husband's defense collapsed, formally admitting on record that she had personally received and stored the childhood photographs in her closet. Her complete capitulation spared her from severe legal penalties, but her social standing and public reputation were permanently shattered, and their high-priced attorney withdrew from representation before the final paperwork was signed. Back in the suburbs, the consequences quickly dismantled their carefully curated life. Claire temporarily cut off all communication with her parents, retreating into her college dorm and refusing to answer their desperate phone calls. She explicitly requested that her name, Academic records and personal life remain entirely separate from any public discussions or fallout involving the lawsuit, and I respected her boundaries completely, refusing to use my sister as a weapon to punish them further. Stripped of their illusion of moral superiority, Michael and Laura lost the ability to play the role of grieving victims in front of their suburban neighbors and church community. Unpaid legal fees, mounting debts, and massive court fines eventually forced them to put their spacious suburban home on the market. The forced sale was simply the mathematical result of compounding bad choices and aggressive litigation, not some malicious scheme where I personally seized their property. Even so, Laura mailed a desperate handwritten letter to Mara's office a week before the house closed, begging for financial assistance to help them retain the property. I met them one final time, choosing the neutral conference room at Mara's office rather than the garage or their driveway. Michael immediately launched into an angry tirade, screaming that I had systematically destroyed his entire life out of pure spite and malice. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my voice entirely even, and told him the truth. I reminded him that I did not destroy anything because I merely stopped protecting the fragile lie that held his artificial world together. Laura wept softly across the table, whispering that they were still my parents, and asking how I could be so cold. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me and told her quietly that they were my parents for the first 8 years of my life, but Cal was my father for the rest of it. I refused to hand over a single cent, and I made it clear there would be no future contact. With the estate finally settled, I turned my complete focus back to the property that mattered. I sold the unused back section of the commercial lot to a local real estate developer, securing a high price while locking a strict legal covenant into the deed that preserved the historic entrance and structure of the garage exactly as it was. I used a portion of the funds to clear out the remaining shop debts, invested the rest conservatively, and set aside capital to officially launch a specialized mechanical apprenticeship program named after Cal, designed specifically to mentor young adults transitioning out of the foster care system. The garage opened under the new program on a crisp Tuesday morning. The air inside smelled of fresh motor oil, hot coffee, and polished steel. Walking into my private office, I stepped up to the wall and hung a framed photograph of Cal, standing proudly beside me on my high school graduation day, adjusting my bright blue cap with his rough, grease-stained hands. A quiet knock echoed on the open office door. Mara stood in the doorway, holding a thick manila envelope that had just arrived through courier mail. She set it gently on the wooden desk without saying a word, turned around, and walked back out into the bright work bays. I picked up the heavy paper envelope. The return address featured sprawling, familiar handwriting. Laura had mailed one final letter after losing their suburban home. The heavy paper contained no demands for money, no legal threats, and no desperate pleas for forgiveness. I did not tear the envelope open, and I did not throw it straight into the trash can. Instead, I pulled open the top desk drawer, dropped the unopened letter inside, and slid the heavy wood shut until the latch clicked firmly into place. Stepping back out into the sunlit garage, the sound of impact wrenches and lively laughter filled the air as the new apprentices went to work on a vintage engine block. For the very first time in my life, silence was not something a frightened adult used to abandon me in the dark. It was simply a boundary I had chosen for myself, knowing I no longer needed an answer from the past to know who I was. You spend years waiting for the people who left you to realize your worth, believing their approval is the key to your peace, but that is a trap. Real family is never defined by the blood in your veins or the excuses people make when they abandon you in the dark. It is built by the hands that stay, the shoulders that carry your burdens when you are weak, and the quiet sacrifices made without condition. Stop letting the past dictate your worth. Choose your own boundaries. Honor those who truly stayed, and build your life on truth.